the end of the day, advocacy is trying to achieve change, but how can we as people working on a project know at the end that we've actually achieved any change? We can say we've done things, but can we actually say what the impact is? And that draws me to the second bullet point here, which therefore means that advocacy is hard to evaluate, not impossible by any means, and that's why we've been talking about these things in these 3 webinars, but it does need to be done in a specific way to make sure you know exactly what impact your advocacy-based project has actually had. So firstly, definitions and background. We've seen these slides before, but there's nothing wrong with revising it, especially for people new to M&E, because it keeps ensuring that we know exactly what terminology we're working with. So monitoring is the routine tracking and reporting of priority information about a program or project, its inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So that's what happens during the lifetime of a project. It could be a 6-month project, it could be a 3-year project, but the monitoring is for collecting data during the lifetime of a project. The evaluation comes right at the end, and that's a systematic collection of information about the program or intervention activities, the characteristics and outcomes that tell us really how well it's done. Has this program been successful? I would not say that programs necessarily fail, but at the evaluation you would make recommendations for what needs to be done now to make sure that the anticipated outcomes can be achieved. And evaluation provides useful information for improvement as well for other projects you might be doing in a similar area. Why do we do monitoring and evaluation? Well, this is clear, and these are very quick bullet points to reflect on the process, to learn lessons for future projects, to allow for evidence-based and strategic decision making, provide stories and hard evidence for future resource mobilization. And the stories are interesting because what I've found working on advocacy-based projects, it's stories that are really important. So when you talk to people who might have benefited from the project, how has this worked for you? Has the project or the outcomes had an impact on your life? And this is very important when we come to talking about whether a program has been successful or not. M&E is useful for transparency, honesty. Where has all the money gone? Because that takes us to the last bullet point on here, accountability. At the end of the day, somebody paid for this project, so you need to go back to them saying that we did this, we did that, and the impact was this, and the impact was that. And therefore the donor feels they've got value for money for the project they've been funding. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about 2 main types of tools that are used during monitoring in order to make the evaluation at the end of the project most effective. So the first of these is something called advocacy asks. Now you might have heard of advocacy asks. It's not a new idea in advocacy, but they're very useful to think about right at the beginning of a project because it helps you know what you actually want at the end of a project. So what are advocacy asks? Well, they're the results that strategy aims to achieve, and they're based on the theory of change. Now, we talked about theory of change during the last presentation. The asks come out of the theory of change and are more specific things around what you actually want to achieve. And the asks you want from a project will feed into the messaging. We've all worked on advocacy projects. I'm sure many of you have more experience than I have. And the messaging that is part of the core activity of an advocacy project is very, very important. Advocacy asks are very specific. They're not ambiguous at all. They're very clear in what they are asking for, and they state the desired outcomes defined in the advocacy strategy, which is something that you do at the beginning, which is where you do the theory of change, where you decide on how you're going to evaluate it, what indicators, and you also decide what asks you are going to be using to underpin the activities. Many advocacy projects, I mean, the ones I worked on, I mentioned at the beginning, Link Up and Asia Action, they both had around about 3 or 4 asks for each country. So each project included multiple countries, but each country ran its own advocacy program, and each of them had 3 or 4. So it's not going to be a huge, great thing. It's a bit like the theory of change. Theories of change look complex, but when you drill down, they're actually asking very specific things and anticipating very specific outcomes. But some other projects have 12, 15. I'm working on a project now in the Philippines and Sri Lanka, and each of those countries has around about 15 asks, which is fine. That's what they wanted at the beginning. But as an evaluator, if I go in at the end after 3 years and try and see if they've achieved impact from these 15 asks, that will be quite difficult. And therefore, one of the benefits of focusing on lower numbers of asks is it helps you know how well you're doing during the program. And it also helps the evaluator at the end not be overwhelmed with information trying to find whether these asks have actually been achieved. I've just put down here 2 examples of asks. A very good ask is this one: a client-centered support and treatment model is in place as an alternative to the compulsory detention model. This is obviously from a harm reduction program. It's very specific, you know exactly what you want, and at the end, if there's a support and treatment model in place, you know you've achieved the ask. I put 2 examples of asks that are less focused. One is stigma and discrimination is reduced, which of course we know, and these kind of stigma and discrimination is woven through all the projects we work on. But as something that you want to actually know the impact at the end of, it's quite tricky and it's very non-specific, because in a sense it's everywhere. So do you want something more specific than that? And the second example of something which is not particularly focused would be regular meetings are held with stakeholders to discuss harm reduction in prisons. Okay, yeah, the meetings will be useful, but do you want anything more specific than that? How many meetings do you want? With who? With which stakeholders? Which prisons? Which cities? So it's not particularly focused. And if you remember our discussion about SMART objectives in the previous webinar, that's very similar to developing advocacy asks, because at the end of the day, you've got to have something that you know you've achieved, and not just something at the beginning of a 3-year project that sounds really nice, because you've got to think 3 years in the future. Right at the end, well, how do we know we've achieved this? I mentioned before the asks form part of the they're derived from the theory of change and form part of the messaging, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. I'm slipping between 2 screens here. You've not deja vu. I've talked about this slide. This is the next one I want. Advocacy asks are part of the core messaging and are vital for shaping strategy and monitoring. They do come from a theory of change. So we talked last week about the theory of change, last time about the theory of change, and they are drawn from the theory of change because the theory of change gives you the map, the kind of guidelines for getting from beginning to end, and the asks flow from the theory of change because they're what you want right at the end of the project. The asks allow a narrowing of focus, so it helps you decide at 3 years before the project finishes, if it's a 3-year project, what you want to get at the end. So it's a way of refining the theory of change down into specific outcome statements. This is an example of the theory of change. I'm not going to talk it through. I've used this as an example numerous times, but this is a working theory of change that was used in Myanmar 3 years ago on the Link Up project. We've talked about this before. I don't want to talk about this again, but just to draw your attention to the 2 long-term outcomes at the bottom, which we've talked about already. And then these are the advocacy asks that come from that theory of change. And again, I'm not going to read these out, but you can see the project managers, the policy people decided on the theory of change, then they developed the asks. And these asks relate directly back to the theory of change. And they cover the 3 main themes in the theory of change. And these 3 asks, as you can see, are that SRHR needs of young people are included in the National Service Plan. That's the first. Second is that all policies promote full integration of HIV and SRHR for young people. That's the second ask. And the third ask is that there are good quality, confidential healthcare services available for young people. So 3 very specific focused asks. And if you go back to the theory of change, I'm not going to do it now, but you could see those asks are reflected throughout here because they all mention including young people in policy making it's also mentioned in here is policies should address the rights of young people and HIV and SRHR, and they also address services. So you can see how they ask some straight out of the theory of change, and enable you to be very specific as to what you're going to actually try and get changed, and what you're going to say to stakeholders. These are our messages. These are the asks we want. This is another example of some advocacy asks from India for a harm reduction project. Again, I'm not going to read all this through, but the way they've done it is slightly different, which is interesting. First of all, on the left, you can see they developed the advocacy asks. These are quite specific. They relate to law enforcement engaging with people using drugs. They relate to local healthcare workers relating meaningfully with drugs. And the third one relates to women accessing services, which, if you know anything about harm reduction, particularly in Asia, is a real problem because women don't access services as much as men. What they did was, though, they developed these a little bit like, it's not a theory of change, but they developed an idea of what kind of things they wanted at certain points. What was present now, which is very little for all three asks, what might be present halfway through, what might be present at the end. So you can see asks can actually be part of your M&E process, because you can aim for certain things at certain points. And again, this will be reflecting the theory of change in some ways, because the theory of change will have very similar types of stages of things you might want to achieve. One thing we haven't talked about in any of these three presentations, which would be worthy of another presentation, is the whole idea of baselines, because in all projects, it's good to have a baseline review at the beginning of the project to actually tell you what is missing and what you want to advocate for in order to make some changes to bring those things into existence. I just wanted to highlight it here. I didn't want it to slip off our M&E radar, because even in advocacy-based projects, which are a bit more nebulous, there is still a baseline process right at the beginning of the project where you know what is missing, and then what you know then that tells you what to advocate for by the end of the project. And just to illustrate where the asks sit, in developing a strategy, the theory of change comes first. We talked about that last time. Then you develop the advocacy asks, and then from them come the core messaging. So you can see the process is strategic, and it's all part of the development of an advocacy strategy, and all these things will be part of the advocacy strategy. Other bits we're not going to talk about during these three webinars are indicators that might tell you what you need to know, and the stakeholders you might aim your advocacy at, and the advocacy champions you might include in your battles, but they will all go into the advocacy strategy and be an important part of the strategy, together with your theory of change, your asks, and your core messaging. So that's what advocacy asks are. I'm happy to answer further questions at the end, but I think if you can see how they emerge from the theory of change and how they're very specific and focused, and will provide the core messages you want to tell your targets for advocacy, then I think you will have grasped it for using advocacy asks. So the next thing I want to talk about is advocacy logs. Now, you may not have heard of these. These are, you may have done, but they're a less common part of evaluation of advocacy projects, but they're especially useful, probably more so for advocacy projects than any other type of projects you may be involved in. So advocacy logs they're a way of recording for the entire project duration activities relating to the asks. So the log is used to keep a track of key moments, key things that happen. You meet somebody in a corridor, somebody you're targeting with your advocacy, you talk with them. What comes out of that meeting? Where do you record it? Well, you put it into the advocacy log. I met so-and-so this morning. He or she seemed to be changing their opinion about this. You write it down. The advocacy log is usually recorded for recording three types of things. First of all, trigger points, where somebody might have changed an idea because of you talking to them. So you write it down. The second thing could be turning points, where somebody really changes their idea, somebody who's really anti something you are advocating for suddenly turns right around and says, okay, well, maybe you're right, maybe we should do this, okay, what can we do? You write it down. Or any progress. For example, this is an example I've given here is from a project. You finally get approval to give training to police officers on harm reduction. Write it down. Now, it might sound obvious that this, yeah, write it down, whatever. But in a long project, knowing that in the 4th month of the project, somebody changed their mind, or in the 14th month of the project, somebody changed their mind, or you had a good meeting with somebody, 3 years right at the end of it's looking back, you can really see a development in what's gone on during the project. So like old diaries, when you write it down, when you write something down, it seems obvious on that day, but a year later you come back to that and you think, oh yeah, I remember that was good. That's why an advocacy log is important. The last thing to note in advocacy logs is are blockages. If something just can't get done, write it down. Why can't it get done? And at the end of the project, if some things haven't been achieved, then you can look back into year 2, for example, if it's a 3-year project, and you think, yes, this is why we didn't get it done. So then that would go to the recommendations for the next project. We need to target this particularly because we had problems with it on this previous project. Advocacy logs are also useful for noting down signatures, a particular message you might have used if you're talking to a stakeholder, a signature to the project. If it's harm reduction project, is something about, for example, here, the example I've given is rights to take methadone home. And also useful context on a certain day, if say UNAIDS releases something that is relevant to your project, you note it down, because then, again, as I say, a year in the future, 2 years in the future, when the project has been evaluated, knowing that that UNAIDS project came out at the same time gives you interesting ways to discuss about why advocacy might have worked or why it might not have worked. And certainly as an evaluator coming in to do an evaluation right at the end of a 3-year project, seeing these bits that have been noted down during the 3 years, if it's 3 years, is really useful because it gives you an idea that as an evaluator, what was going on around this time? Why did this get blocked? Why did this go through very quickly? And therefore it gives you an important source to put into the narrative you're writing about whether the advocacy project worked or not. So advocacy logs have a number of these are very generic headings. You can do it in a Word document, or we had some people doing it in Word, some people do it in Excel, whichever way you feel most comfortable. But it's a series of columns. It's got the date, but it's got the asks, it's got the theme, the activity or events, key stakeholders. You can see what it's written there. What is interesting about the logs, though, is this bit here, because this is where the advocacy asks come in useful for tracking activities during a program, because when there is a certain event you're recording in the log, or a meeting or an event or a report or something, you write down which advocacy ask it relates to. Because again, at the end of a project, if you can see which activity is related to which ask, and it makes it much easier to track the effectiveness of particular interventions and particular progress on the asks. And these are some examples of the kind of entries you might see in an advocacy log. You can see here that this particular entry relates to advocacy ask 1. The theme is arrest rates of people using drugs. The activity was meeting a police commissioner. We've got a name, the deputy person there who was attending. We've got the results, the agreement of something. The signature was people using drugs should have access to community-based treatments with methadone. And the useful context is that the police are supportive, politicians are more likely to agree, which in this particular case, this is a real entry in harm reduction program in India. The police, if they are supportive, then the politician will start to be more receptive, and therefore it's very useful to know that. And as I said earlier, this seemed obvious to write on the day of the meeting, but a year later, when you're looking back, you can start to see process and progress on certain parts of the program. This is an example of perhaps less useful entries, certainly from an evaluation perspective. The first 3 or 4 columns are the same, but the results, useful discussions about key issues. What does that actually mean? It's not particularly useful. Signature used, harm reduction is not available for all PUD. Well, yeah, okay, but that's not particularly specific, because if you remember, it was actually about access to CBT and methadone treatment. And notes taken, yeah, what does that mean? It's useless. So you can see how 2 years down the line coming back to this, it's useless, I can't do anything with this. But if you 2 years down the line came back to that, then you could see something that was actually quite useful. This is actually a screenshot of a real advocacy log that was used in India by the India AIDS Alliance, who are very effective at doing advocacy for harm reduction. And you can see that the left-hand column has AA is the advocacy asks. So the first line is advocacy asked 2 and 3. You can see that the entries in the log, but you can see they don't have to be huge. You don't have to do 15, 20 entries a day. You can see on the dates here, they did one on one day, one the next day, one 3 or 4 days later, one 3 days later, and then one a couple of weeks later, maybe, just about. So it doesn't have to be done every day. If you just write something in once a week, after a 3-year project, you've still got maybe 145, 150 entries, which can be really useful in seeing what kind of activities are taking place during the project. And this is again just zooming in to the left-hand columns where they used the advocacy asks to group their entries, and this is really useful because this particular project I think had maybe 3 advocacy asks, only 3 advocacy asks. So they were very specific about the top line here is, yeah, these activities, this activity, World AIDS Day meeting with the UNODC, it related to advocacy ask 2 and advocacy ask 3. So that's really useful for an evaluator to see that, and also useful for the organization because they can look back and see what actually has been going on. I came into this project 3 years after they'd started, and looking back over the 3 years of entries, you could really see they made progress. And though there was material elsewhere, it saved me having to trawl through meeting notes or trawl through emails or trawl through reports because they got the reference here, so that I could easily go to find out exactly what's been going on. So that's advocacy logs. And if you've got any questions about those, then do get in touch. I can send you further examples. I put together a toolkit on how to use these and asks, so you're welcome to use that. So what about using these things? What about actually making them work in the real world? So let's talk about the asks first. The asks are generated at the beginning of a project. They mesh with the theory of change and are often quite similar to the long-term objectives, but they're maybe more focused, and they're the kind of information you would give to a stakeholder who is your advocacy target. You can have as many as you want. I mentioned earlier, some projects had 3 or 4, the ones I worked with. I mentioned earlier I'm working with one that has 15, but 15 is fine, but it just would make it more difficult to track during a project, 15 as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5. And also at the end, how would you demonstrate you'd actually achieved anything in those 15 asks? It'd be a very paper-intensive exercise. The indicators you develop with the theory of change, we talked about that last week. These are standard indicators. You know, I'm sure, how to do indicators. Could be used to track the progress of the asks. And I know when I worked with the International AIDS Alliance, they actually used a traffic light system during a project every 3 or 4 months. They looked at certain asks and they marked those as red that weren't really progressing very far, yellow that were making progress, and green that had been achieved. And what was interesting is occasionally we found that the harm reduction project, because it's 3 years, some of the organizations did really well and they achieved an ask within 8 months. So they then developed another ask and then used that to cover the rest of the project. So keeping track of the asks during a project using a simple, I mean, there are other ways, but I've seen organizations use this traffic light system. It's really good because if you do really well on an ask, then do another ask for something else to see if you can get that, because then you can actually end up achieving quite a lot by the end of a project. And this is a quote from somebody who actually used the asks. This is a project leader from Cambodia, and she said that advocacy asks are helpful to make us focus and be consistent in reaching our advocacy goals. The first time I used advocacy asks, it made me systematic in my approach and to know what I should achieve by the middle and end of the project, which I think is quite interesting. And it proves that these asks as a way of refining your advocacy project can be very useful, particularly in something as complex in this example as harm reduction. So what about the advocacy logs? Practicalities. Well, I mentioned earlier they're a bit like a diary or a garden of flowers or an aquarium of fish. They do require constant attention. They're very needy things, and if they're left to wither, they'll become lifeless, and worse, from the evaluator at the end of a project, be out of date. And I mentioned earlier, I'm working on a project that covers Philippines and Sri Lanka at the moment. One of the countries is really good at keeping their logs up to date. They maybe have 2 or 3 entries a month, which is fine, because during a 3-year project, that will give you, 80 or 90 entries by the end of a project. The other, I know for a fact, hasn't filled in their logs since November 2016, which is fine. And what they did in the 2016 was fine, what they put in the log, but they haven't filled it in since then. So for me, trying to track the M&E, I want to ask, so what have you actually done since 2016? Yes, you've had meetings, you've got reports, you've got emails, but where is it all? How do we know all that is? How do we get all that together into a meaningful track? Because you haven't been filling in the advocacy log. So you can see I'm going to have a problem when I evaluate this project of one country doesn't have all the information ready for me. The other one will say, we've got this log, which is a year out of date. So I'm going to have to hunt around for what happened in the last year to get things up to date. Some entries are short. It doesn't have to be a huge entry. It's an aid memoir a lot of the time. It's just to remind you that something happened, and if you need more information, you can go straight back to that and pick it out. Any person can enter material into the log. But it's useful to have one person identified who fills in the advocacy log and make sure it's kept up to date. It could be an M&E person if there's an M&E person, or it could be the policy person. It could be consultant or the project manager, just as long as somebody checks in maybe every 1 or 2 weeks and just keeps it up to date, keeps topping it up, just get someone to do it. And also in all the projects I've worked with using advocacy logs, it's good to have technical support. Just send it to somebody. Is this kind of information that's going to be helpful? And as a consultant doing M&E, they'd probably send that to me, but it can be anybody, just so that somebody's getting comments of what they're putting in, so that after 3 years, we haven't got a log that's full of stuff that isn't really very useful. So it's a quality check, really. And as it's Game of Thrones time, I think we need to just remind ourselves that the logs need nurturing, just like the dire wolves. They need nurturing. They're little children that need caring for, little puppies, and then they'll do what you want them to do. This is a quote about using logs from an advocacy manager, a policy manager who works in India. The first year using the logs was a lot of trial and error. It was a struggle to find the right balance between what to put in and what to leave out. Categorizing according to advocacy asks and adding appropriate filters for topic focus this was. So I think they put in a theme column, but it depends how you want to do it. It does help in tracking, and overall the advocacy log is absolutely essential for any advocacy project. And for this particular person, he found that, like we've been discussing already in this webinar, 2 years down the line, you can look back and see all the things you've done in the first and second years, and it gives you a feeling that you are achieving things, or at least you're connecting and making progress in the project. And for an M&E, it can really be useful in telling people, in showing what's actually being done and what's been achieved. So the final thoughts then. Concluding thoughts, really, some of these we've discussed before. M&E is about comparing actual outcomes and impacts with what was expected. It needs to be systematic. But the third point here, advocacy asks and logs are useful for planning and tracking advocacy activities and insights into progress towards the intended outcomes. It gives you the bits to fill in between the beginning and the end of the project. Advocacy logs in particular are very helpful for capturing examples of evidence that can be used for both monitoring and evaluation. I think we talked in the very first webinar about M&E. It's the evidence. It could be a phone call, it could be an email, it could be a WhatsApp message, it could be an SMS, it could be a Facebook message. And if you just note it down in the log, then 2 years ahead, you've got it there. Whereas if you forget to put it in, if it's something like that, which is pretty ephemeral, it means you having to hunt through 2 years of Facebook messages to find the one that this particular person sent, perhaps, or something else. So if you put it down straight away, then it can be very useful. And the final comment really on what we've been talking about over the last 3 webinars is, firstly, advocacy impact is difficult to evaluate. The outcomes tend to be a mix of things that can be measured, a policy change, a new program, and the things that seem more qualitative, a bit more nebulous. A key issue is being discussed more by a group of people. So it's less easy to be specific. And for that type of qualitative thing, you might need another type of evidence, like an email message, like a text, like a Facebook message, or something that you can put into that. Yeah, okay, well, this person is emailing me more or texting me more, so maybe he or she is showing an interest in this project way before, in this topic, whereas before they didn't do that. But regardless, M&E for advocacy projects should still be systematic, and we shouldn't be limited just saying we did something, we ran a workshop. We want to know about actual changes. So what was the impact of that workshop? What was happening 3 months after the workshop, for example? We did this training with the police about harm reduction. Okay, we did the training, 20 police officers attended. So what's been the impact 3 months down the line? Has there been a difference in the way that the police interact, if it's harm reduction, for example? And in this short series of webinars, we've looked at 3 things. We've looked at general approaches to M&E for advocacy-based projects. We've looked at theories of change as a way to plan a project from beginning to end with a pathway from here to there, with highlights at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end, which are the outcomes we expect. And we've looked at advocacy asks and logs, which are more tools for tracking progress during a project. The asks are clear statements of what you want to achieve, the kind of things that you would share with your targets, but they can also be red, yellow, green lighted throughout. And advocacy logs as a way of taking a diary approach to, so what did we do on this day or in this week for advocacy? And I do hope that you now approach M&E in your programs in a way that tells you you've changed to feel more confident, but also change something from your advocacy, because at the end of the day, advocacy is about changing something. We know what's missing, we advocate for something to fill in the gap, then at the end the gap will be filled and a new policy is in place or something new is happening. And I think what we've been talking about over the last 3 webinars will help us demonstrate that after a project. It could be a short project, it could be a long project, and I hope you feel more confident now about gathering evidence in a systematic way to tell you might have actually achieved something through your advocacy activities. And just to finish, as it's a Game of Thrones theme, I think I can't finish that Game of Thrones. M&E for advocacy can seem worrying and intimidating. It can be scary, and I know some project people can, when they're having an M&E discussion, it seems like winter is coming, and they're reaching the end of their why winter is coming, why. But if you keep nurturing these things, a bit like baby dragons in Game of Thrones, if you adopt and care for the tools you need, feed them, take care of them, let them become your friends, then in the final battle, they will become your most important and core supporters as you try and seek some evidence that tells you you've achieved something and made an impact by the end of your project. So thank you very much for listening, and if we have any questions now, feel free to share them. Christian, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Thank you very much, Ian. I also would like to congratulate you on the beautiful last couple of slides. As a big Game of Thrones fan myself, I really enjoy them, but I also enjoyed the rest of the slides. So yes, if you have questions, you can ask them in 2 ways. You can either write them in the question field, and I will read them out loud for Ian, or you can as well click on the small hand button, and then I will see that you have raised your hand, and then we will be able to unmute you. So wait a second, Marie has raised. So I'm going to unmute you, Marie. Now you're unmuted, you can ask your question.
I am, and I have to admit that I'm not a fan of that series at all. So I find it kind of weird because I have no idea what you're talking about. Okay, so I've never seen one of them, so not one episode. So yeah, anyway, I have questions. I have two questions, or three, actually three. One's about the evaluator. So is the evaluator somebody you would say would be ideally working on the project from the inside, or more somebody who's external looking from the outside in? And does that person start right at the beginning? So right when you're applying, or do they join at a later stage?
Shall I answer that first and then go on to your next one? I think that's a very good question. It depends what kind of project you have. I mean, one of the projects I worked on had the person in from the beginning. It was an external consultant, but supporting the monitoring all the way through. They helped them design the M&E at the beginning, helped them monitor all the way through, and then made a contribution at the end. So it could be that person. Another project I've worked on have done internal M&E during the project, but then brought in an outsider right at the end to do the final evaluation. Right. I think it's many donors, certainly in other parts of the HIV sector, quite like the idea of an independent external evaluator coming in at some point, because he or she is likely to be more questioning about what's actually been going on, which doesn't mean they have to be negative, but maybe more of a tighter critique. Whereas if you have somebody internal doing the evaluation, certainly the evaluation, because the monitoring can be done internally throughout, but the bit at the end where you want the final report, you may want an independent external consultant to do that. It could be done internally, but would the internal person be able to be critical? For example, and I'm not, one project I evaluated, the management was a bit dodgy in certain bits and the finance wasn't very tightly controlled. Could an internal person say that without feeling they were kind of criticizing their colleagues? Whereas an external consultant would be more in a position to say, yeah, this was good, but this was bad, without being critical of a colleague or friend.
But don't you think a funder would take it negatively? If they were
Say it again, sorry?
Well, wouldn't you think a funder would be kind of shocked and if there was kind of a critical evaluation of a project, or they would be happy they were completely transparent?
They would be shocked. They'd be happy with the transparency, although they would be shocked if it was really bad, because their first question would be, what kind of monitoring did you do? Why did it not show up at the end? That's so bad. So in a sense, but then that would fall on the M&E strategy that was formed at the beginning.
At the beginning, yes.
And what you tend to find is final evaluations aren't overcritical, but they might pick up weaknesses. But that's why you need good monitoring throughout, so to pick up things that are going to fail at the end, so you know halfway through you can change something. And this is why you need the markers generated by the theory of change or the advocacy asks, the markers to tell you that we've made no progress on this ask after halfway through. There must be something going wrong, because we should be on yellow by now, for example.
Yeah, no, I get that completely. Yeah, definitely. Okay.
And you had another question?
Yes, another question. So let's take an organization like EATG. So you have a long-term strategy. You have a theory of, let's say we have a theory of change. We have advocacy asks. We have advocacy logs. We have a work plan. We have, let's say, at the moment, 20 projects. How does this all fit together? I mean, I'm not sure. I don't see the links, somehow it seems like a lot of work.
That's a very good question. And I think my answer to that, and somebody else might have a better idea on this, my answer to that would be they work at different levels. So you would have an organizational theory of change, which are the broad things, for example, the EATG might want to achieve. And you could develop a strategy out of that. So that would be what EATG generally wants to achieve after a certain period of time. But then each project, now not all projects will be amenable to this, but the way it works is that each project would have its own theory of change, its own advocacy asks, its own advocacy log, whatever. Other in a sense, that's just recording, isn't it? You're talking about the planning. So it'd be a mini version, it'd be a little standalone version, which reflects the organization, what EATG wants to achieve, obviously, but it would be its own. So I think I shared with you via email before the Alliance, International AIDS Alliance's theory
Yes.
of change,
Yeah.
which was organisation-wide, but the harm reduction project I worked on for them had its own theory of change just for that project because it's fit into a certain timescale and its own advocacy asks and its own work plan that was a kind of small version of what that project wanted to achieve, which was separate, although it reflected generally the Alliance's work. So it works at different levels. But I think you might find that not all projects EATG has will be amenable to this. I mean, they should all have a work plan, obviously. All the projects should have some kind of work plan what they want to do.
Exactly.
There might have a theory of change if it's something you want to change at the end. But if it's simply if it's less advocacy based, you might not even need that. It depends really what kind of project it is. See what I mean? So you'd have each project would be addressed on a project by project basis on how you wanted to structure the M&E, but that would be separate to the overarching EATG strategy and theory of change, which would be reflected everywhere else, but it would be, because they'd be quite broad. The outcomes you want at the end of the strategy for EATG would be quite broad. Obviously, they're quite broad.
Yeah.
But that would be operationalised through the smaller projects, which themselves would have many theories of change, many strategies, and many laws, asks, whatever.
But does that mean
make
that
sense?
the working groups would also need to have their own theory of change and their own advocacy asks? Probably, yes.
If they want to. If they can set time limits on things.
Yeah. Okay.
It might be easier to have a long-term strategy for each of the working groups. Is that what you think? Working groups? Is that what you said? Working groups?
Yeah. Working groups. Yeah.
Yeah. But the core one would have to be the EATG's long-term strategy, because that's really what the organisation is all about, and everything comes out of that.
Okay, I get it. Yep. Thank you.
A good question. That's a very good question, because it gets kind of confusing where these things fit. Yeah. Okay. Is it any other questions?
Ian, can you check your microphone? There's some background noise or some.
I'm sorry. Is it my chair?
Sorry?
Is it my squeaky chair?
I think there's something wrong with your microphone. There's some noise, technical noise.
Sorry. How's that sound?
I think it's the same. Still the same.
Let me just go onto my computer microphone. How's that? Is that okay?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay.
So Rebecca has a question. She also raised her hand, so I'm going to unmute her.
Hello, everybody.
Yes. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi. Yeah, really good discussion. I think, Marie, I totally understand where you're coming from. It just seems like a whole load of things, but actually, when you get used to it, when they come together, it makes life a lot easier in terms of your advocacy projects. So as Ian was saying, it's not going to necessarily be everything won't apply to every project, but it will if you sort of have a look at everything as a whole and work from there. So start with the general strategy and work inwards. That will make it easier. I wanted to share sort of my experiences of evaluating an advocacy project that had a very specific ask, and so you would think it would have been very easy to evaluate because it was a campaign asking for the global fund, or asking the government in that country, that country's government to give a certain amount of money to the global fund, and they achieved that. They actually got what they asked for. The government gave, in fact, a bit more than what they asked. So, evaluating that, you would say, well, easy, they did it. But actually, the one thing that hasn't come up so far, we haven't talked about, is attribution and contribution, where you might have a campaign where quite a few organizations are calling for the same thing. So you might have Médecins Sans Frontières, EATG, and the AIDS Alliance all calling for treatment prices to be lowered, for example. That's just a theoretical example. And say that happens, well, how do you work out, how do you show to the donor that it was your piece of work, your signature, your theory of change, your actual work that led to that, and not the work of others? And that's where the advocacy log comes in particularly well, because you can go back and show evidence that it was you that was at that meeting, that you actually spoke with that minister, or you actually held a meeting, and you can point to the language that you submitted that comes up in press releases that are put out or statements by the ministers, or so you can show to a donor that it might look like there were some high profile organizations or celebrities also at the same time meeting with certain people. You might have Elton John, for example, meeting with the Prime Minister, or a quite senior member of government because of their role and their status in society. And you want to be able to say, well, hang on, we also did this work at a very sort of grassroots level, and we were also working away for this for years. It wasn't just Elton John making a call. You might want to back that up with evidence, and that's where the advocacy log, I think, has a really good role. So I think Ian has made some really good points about how important milestones are and how these tools feel like a lot of work to start with, but actually make your life easier as an advocate, because you need to evaluate yourself all the time with your advocacy strategy. If you're constantly having meetings and not getting anywhere, obviously the strategy needs to change and you need to try a different tack. So it really, if you start to integrate it into your way of working, it replaces other meetings and it makes you more effective if you use this strategy. So I recommend it.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. That's really perfect. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. And what just to add on to that, yes, the attribution contribution is interesting, because certainly the two projects I did most recently, there was mostly attribution for the work they did, and we could see impact from that. But it was clearly other organisations had done the same thing at the same time, so it was teasing apart. And that's part of the narrative of the report. You're right. So you tease apart. Yes, they did contribute to this. They did help here. They did maybe get support there. But this is specifically what they did, and this led to this. And yeah, the log was very useful for identifying very clearly what one organisation had done that led very clearly to a particular impact.
I have one question also about the advocacy logs. Because there was your second quote in your presentation, there was one person who was saying, actually, I don't really know what to put in these logs because it's really difficult to select. So I wanted to ask you, how do we know what to write in these advocacy logs? So is it really like only meetings with really some high level politicians, or is it subjective feeling that some conversation went well? How do we select things to?
That's a very good question. It could be a bit of both, actually, because clearly any meeting you have relating to the project should be recorded somehow in the log, I would say, because that's what the project is all about, advocating for something. So if it's related to that. But it could be smaller things as well, like a newspaper article is published on a day that's relevant, that seems to fit with the arguments you're presenting. So put it down, because even though it's not something you've done, it's a kind of contextual thing that A, will help you remember it's there anyway, but B, it helps you create a narrative of how things are developing at a certain time in the context. And this is why, but it's a very good question, because this is why it's good to have a quality check. After 2 or 3 months, send it to somebody. It could be an M&E person, or it could be a consultant if there's a consultant doing the M&E, just somebody, just to make comments on it about whether it's provided the kind of information you need. But I think all the organisations that started with this, because the harm reduction projects I've mentioned throughout these 3 webinars, they were all new to advocacy logs, and all of them after 3 or 4 months had got it cracked. They'd found out, they got into a rhythm, and they realised there were certain things they probably didn't need to record. But there are key moments that clearly needed to be noted down. And I think you saw on the dates I showed, I mentioned it as well, you probably find 1 or 2 key things each week that could go into the log, but after a long project that will soon accumulate into a wealth of evidence that can be used for something. It's a matter of feeling your way through, but after 2 or 3 months, when you look back, you'll be able to see, and it's a learning process, but it's pretty clear after a short time what is going to be useful.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? I don't see any hand raised. Also, we don't have any written questions. So I would like to thank you, Ian, once again for the 3 webinars. I think they were all really good and really useful. Thank you all for joining the webinar, and the recording will be made available soon afterwards.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tristan.